Hello, and welcome to Book 2, Chapter 16 of You Should Be Reading. I think I'm going to be doing away with the intros for a little while, mostly because I just can't seem to think up anything really good to put in them. So you'll have to do without. But today, I'm going to talk about David Eddings' The Losers. Now, any of you who are familiar with David Eddings' work will know that he's done a lot of fantasy. He's done The Belgariad, which is 5 books, followed by its sequel, The Malorian, which is 5 more, followed by a couple of standalone novels. He's also done The Tumuli and the Elenium. He's done The Redemption of Althalis, which is kind of a standalone fantasy epic. And all of them kind of follow more or less the same uh, formula. Some people say if you read one David Eddings book, you've read them all, and that's kind of similar. It's a point. I will grant that. But the simple fact remains that while he does have a very formulaic way of writing, as I've mentioned in the past, I'm not opposed to that, as long as the stories are good and entertaining, which they are. But this one in particular is different. This book actually takes place in the quote unquote real world, takes place on Earth in Portland, Oregon, and it is about a young man by the name of Raphael Taylor, who is the golden boy, as they say. Blonde, handsome, charming, gifted athlete, serious student, very much a good boy. He ends up going to college in Portland, and there he meets a man, another fellow student by the name of Damon Flood, who is everything that Raphael is not. Very much a scoundrel, um, kind of smooth, cynical, a devil, devious and corrupt, that sort of thing. Now, the interesting thing is, I spent most of this book looking at all of the very, very obvious religious terminology, uh, or rather, not terminology, religious symbolism, we'll say. Symbology? In joke. But the religious symbolism going on here. And I thought it would come to pass when everything finally ended up that Raphael was going to actually be an angel and Damon was actually going to be a devil, that there was going to be a supernatural element. I spent the entire book waiting for that supernatural element to come and plunk itself down and make itself known, and it never does. Apologies if that was a spoiler, but you should know by now, spoilers will happen sometimes in this program. But yeah, it never comes to pass, and it really it really amazed me because I spent this whole book. There's kind of this build-up, this atmosphere that it's going to happen, but it never does. And the ending of it all is really, really quite remarkable and bizarre and strange. So yes, I don't want to I don't want to spoil any of that part of the ending because you really have to read it to believe it. But it ends up going through quite a bit of interesting. He ends up Raphael early on gets in an accident, more or less due to Damon Flood, and ends up, I believe, losing one of his legs in the accident, so no longer an athlete anymore. And things seem to start going downhill for him. But it sort of does and doesn't turn itself around. It's a weird book, and I really don't want to spoil too much more than that. But it is very much worth the read. Even if you're not particularly fond of David Eddings, it is worth checking out simply because of that. So today I will leave you with this. Fortuna Imperatrix Mundi. Mrs. Muriel Taylor was 38 years old when she found that she was pregnant. Mrs. Taylor was a pale, almost transparent woman of Canadian background, who, until that startling discovery, had lived in a kind of dreamy reverie filled with semi-classical music and the endlessly reworked verses to which she devoted 2 hours every afternoon and never allowed anyone to read. The pregnancy ran its normal course, although Mrs. Taylor had miscarried twice before. She laid aside her poetry and devoted herself wholly to the life within her, seeming almost to wish at times that she might, like some exotic insect, be consumed from within by it and fall away like a dead husk at the moment of birth. She labored with the selection of a suitable name for her unborn son, for he would surely be a boy, as she had never before struggled with the surly intransigencies of language, emerging finally with the one name that would lift her still womb-drowsing infant above the commonplace, beyond that vast, ever-expanding mob of Joeys and Billies and Bobbies and Donnies. She would, she decided, call him Raphael. And having made that decision, she fell back into her drowse. And in the usual course of time, she was delivered of a son, and he was christened Raphael. Mr. Edgar Taylor, Mrs. Taylor's husband, was a man best described as gray. His hair, the suits he wore to the office, even his face. Mr. Taylor was an accountant, much more at home with columns of figures than with people, and the sudden appearance of an heir, the product of his somewhat tepid passion, seemed to stun him. He gave up all outside activities so that he might hurry home each night to watch his son, not to touch him or to speak to him, but simply to watch in a kind of bemused astonishment this prodigy that he and his wife had somehow wrought. The Taylors lived in Port Angeles, a small damp city on the extreme northwest coast. The peninsula below it is given over in a large part to a national park, roadless and pristine, and the city thus has an insular character, cut off from the sprawling bustle of Seattle, Tacoma, and the other population centers of the state by a deep, dotted island sound. All significant travel to and from Port Angeles is by ferry. The nearest major city is Victoria, in British Columbia, a curiously European metropolis where Mr. Taylor had traveled on business some years earlier and had met and intermittently courted Mrs. Taylor. In due time they had married, and he had brought her back across the 26 miles of intervening water to the dank clamminess of Port Angeles, with its rain and fog, and its reek of green hemlock logs lying low in the salt waters of the bay. From the beginning, Raphael was one of those rare children, touched, it seemed, by a singular grace that gave everything he did a kind of special significance. As an infant he seldom cried, and he passed through the normal stages of early childhood with a minimum of fuss. His mother, of course, devoted her entire existence to him. Long after he matured to the point where her constant attentions were no longer necessary, or even desired, she was forever touching him, her hand moving almost of its own will to lingeringly caress his face or his hair. Perhaps because of that special grace, or perhaps because of some long-forgotten gene in his make-up, Raphael avoided the pitfalls that almost inevitably turn the pampered child into a howling monster. He grew instead into a sturdy, self-reliant little boy, gracious to his playmates and polite to his elders. Even as a child, however, he was adept at keeping his feelings to himself. He was outgoing and friendly on the surface, but seemed to reserve a certain part of himself as a private sanctuary, from which he could watch and say nothing. He did well in school, and as he matured developed into that kind of young man his infancy had promised, tall, slimly muscular, with glowing, almost luminous eyes, and pale blond hair that stubbornly curled in spite of all efforts to control it. Now, as you can see, I'll cut off there, I don't want to read too much, just from that little opening bit, he lays the groundwork that makes you really think. And with the cover, with the wings and everything, and the name, I spent the entire book expecting angelic interference of some sort. So it was really, really an interesting book, really worth the read. And it definitely pokes an unflattering eye into a certain demographic of people, we'll say. So yes, this week you should be reading The Losers by David Eddings. And I'll see you next week.